everybody, welcome back to another Rain and Pours video. This one I'm doing something a little bit different. I won't be doing any actual painting. I wanted to do a little glossary of terms that we may come across in our painting journey and explain a few things that might be causing some confusion for some people. So I'll break it down into individual sections. I'll tell you what the word is and the meaning, and I'll try and show some examples if I can. So the first one that we'll go through is opacity. Opacity. Opacity is the quality or state of a body that makes it impervious to rays of light. In other words, how easy is it for light to pass through that object or that substance? So in paint terms, that means a paint that is opaque will not let any color that's underneath show through. A paint that is semi-opaque will still be very hard to see anything underneath, but you may see a little bit of color blending. And a paint that is semi-transparent will allow a fair bit of color to blend through, and a paint that is transparent will basically cast a color cast over your other paints, and they do tend to get lost in paint pours unless they're being used by themselves or with other complementary colors. So you want to really use them in a way that's going to be beneficial to your pour. So I'll demonstrate what opacity actually is with a couple of examples that I've got here. Something that is transparent would be like this plastic container lid. You can see straight through it, and it doesn't matter how close or how far away from the camera you put this, you'll always be able to see everything through it with great detail. So things like your window panes, plastic sheets, all that sort of thing, they are classified as transparent. Something that may be classified as semi-transparent would be baking paper. So baking paper, when it's down on the surface, you can see what's underneath it. There is still a little bit of detail there, but as soon as you lift it off the surface, that now becomes invisible. So this is something we would call semi-transparent, and if you layer another sheet of baking paper on top, I would call this semi-opaque. You can still see through it, but it's a lot more obscured than if you had just one sheet. Now if you layered a third sheet on top of that, you would get something that's very close to being completely opaque. So the same thing applies when you're painting. If you are layering transparent on transparent on transparent, you're building up opacity, but your colors will blend. So for example, if you had a red paint on the bottom and then you put a yellow paint on top, this area here would be orange. If I remove this and say for example we had a shorter piece of baking paper and we made this one red and this one yellow, this part in the middle would be orange, this would remain red, and this would remain yellow. This is if you were doing it on a white background. If you were to add in your third color and you made this for example blue, you would get red, orange and yellow, but then you would also have down here off camera blue by itself, but in the middle you'd also have a blend of blue and whatever orange this makes. So your transparencies will blend. However, if we use opaque paints, and for this example I will use paper. So paper by itself is almost completely opaque. If you were to put something on the back of it, you may be able to see through it, but paper I would call opaque, and if you layered two opaque paints you wouldn't be able to see the one underneath through it. So when you are doing that, if you were to put down your opaque paint first, followed by your transparent, you can clearly see the opaque paint underneath. However, if you put your opaque paint on top of a transparent paint, you cannot see that transparent underneath. And that's really important when you're layering your paints, because if you put an opaque paint on top, you won't be able to see any other color that's underneath it. They are less likely to blend with other colors as well. So for example, if you had an opaque yellow and an opaque red, they won't blend to make orange because both pigments are as opaque as each other and they won't mix. So unless you're doing something like a Dutch pour where your paints are really fluid, you won't get a great deal of color blending. So that's really important to remember when you're painting and for any technique. When I refer to layer blending, I'm referring more to the Bloom technique as that's what I'm used to. However, it does apply to every pouring technique. So where you're putting your paints in your cup, whether you put your opaque paint on the very last layer in your cup so that it's the first one when it goes down if you're doing a flip cup or a ring pour or something like that, or if you're doing a Dutch pour, if you put an opaque paint down last, it's more likely to flow over your other colors and become more prominent and drown out your other colors. So a lot of people don't understand that, especially when doing various pouring techniques, that the opacity of your paints does have a big influence on how prominent they are in your pour. So that's a basic explanation of opacity. Now, when you are buying paints, your paints will have an opacity rating on them, and it's usually denoted by a colored square. So for example, I have a few different variations of reds here. Okay. So these are all Matisse paints, and they're all shades of red. So here I have a transparent red, which is deep rose madder. I have a semi-transparent red, which is primary red, and Mars violet, which is an opaque red. You can tell the transparency of your paints by the little square or circle. Some of them have a circle instead of a square. Transparent is an empty circle or square. Semi-transparent will usually be half filled, and your opaque paints will have a filled in square. You don't normally see semi-opaque, though some paint brands do have semi-opaque and semi-transparent, and they use the same symbol. They don't really make much of a difference. Jo Sonja is one of the brands that uses these circles, and sometimes they don't even have the transparency listed on them. So here's an example of the Jo Sonja paints. This one is Phthalo Blue. It's got the half-filled circle just here. My camera won't focus, so that's a half-filled circle. It's very small on this one, but my permanent alizarin doesn't have a transparency rating on it. So that can be a little bit difficult when picking your colors, but most of them will have that on there, and most brands do it. Just another thing while I've got these in close-up is the series number on your paints. Usually paints with a higher series number are more expensive. This series number is not common across all brands. It is not a standardized way of denoting anything. It is individual to each brand. However, it always means the same thing. It's how rare or how hard it is to get the pigments that are made inside these paints. So for example, a Series 1 paint, like a titanium white or a carbon black, they're usually very easy to manufacture, very easy to get hold of, very easy to make. So they will always be Series 1. However, in Matisse paints, for example, I've got a Series 4 here, I've got a Series 4 and a Series 2. Jo Sonja's, I've got a Series 1 and a Series 2. Series 1 Phthalo Blue would be very easy to get hold of, whereas the permanent alizarin, maybe the pigment's a little bit harder to manufacture, the natural ingredients are a little bit harder to find, and as you go up in series number, they usually become more expensive because the pigments are more difficult to manufacture or to maintain. They have certain properties, the paint's different. So that's just something to look out for when you're buying your paints. If you notice the series number as it gets up is more expensive, that would be why. The pigments are just harder to find or harder to manufacture. Another thing to look for opacity, especially with pigments, is how much you are layering your pigment. So in this example, I had tested the opacity of several brands of pigments here, and this is a little blob test that I did. So you can see in these blobs that you can't see the paper underneath, which means that they're opaque. However, if you brush them on in a thin layer, which is more akin to what we do in all of our pouring styles by stretching our paints, you can see that you can see the paper through them. And certain pigments definitely are more opaque than others. So the This Little Piggy line are my favorite brand of pigment. They are the most opaque out of any of the brands that I tested, and the cheaper Amazon brands just didn't do as well. So the This Little Piggy brand definitely holds up the best in terms of opacity. However, they could be rated at semi-transparent as best. However, the neon colors do tend to be more opaque than the others. This is because of the mica powders in the sparkly pigments being a little bit more coarsely ground than the actual colored pigments, whereas in the neons there is no mica powder to cause that to shift apart. Sort of like gravel in sand. Gravel in sand the bigger particles sort of push the smaller ones out of the way and it separates into layers. Similar thing happens here. The bigger particles of mica push the particles of pigment aside, which allows us to see through them. Next up we have lightfastness. Lightfastness can best be described as the ability of a pigment to hold its colour and tone when exposed to natural light. So a fair few brands denote this on their tubes. For example, Amsterdam denotes theirs by a series of plus signs. So these three symbols down here, you can see the opacity rating in that square to start off with, and then right next to it are 3 plus signs or 2 plus signs. That is the ability of the pigment to hold on to its colour and tone when exposed to natural light. The more plus signs these have, the better that they will withstand on display, in a room, without any sort of further varnish or protection. Adding a layer of UV stable varnish will help to retain the pigment's lightfastness because it will block out the UV light that causes them to discolour. Pigments such as purples and pinks tend to discolour a lot more quickly and a lot more than, say, blues or reds or oranges. So by coating your paintings with a UV protective finish such as a varnish or a resin, you will increase the lightfastness of your paints and increase the longevity of the life of the piece of art, which is ultimately what we want to do. Pigments. I have a whole video of pigments explaining exactly what they are and the difference between dyes, pigments and mica powders. So I'll link that in the description below and try to put it in the card up above. Basically, a pigment is an insoluble colorant that we use to give color to whatever we're trying to use. So they're most often found in the form of a powder, and as I said, they're insoluble, which means they don't dissolve in whatever it is you're placing them into. So in the case of paint, paint can be described as an acrylic polymer-based solution with the pigments in there. So the way I like to visualize it is the paint is full of acrylic chains. So imagine chain links like you would a chain fence, and the pigment in powder form gets suspended inside those acrylic chains. So what happens when all of the water evaporates out of the acrylic paint and your paint is dry, all that's left is the plastic chains holding onto those pigments. Mica powders. Mica is a natural mineral that when ground up into a fine powder gives pigments and paints a shiny quality and a reflective quality. So any iridescent paints, interference colors, they would all just be crushed up mica. Matisse has just released a line of dry mediums, and mica is one of those mediums. So you can use that as a decoration on your paintings, or you can mix it into your paints if it's ground fine enough, and it will reflect light. It doesn't have a color on its own, and I explain a little bit more about mica powders in my pigment video, which again I'll have linked. Dyes. Dyes are soluble chemical colorants which are meant to be a permanent solution to coloring an item. They are most commonly used to dye organic fibers such as paper or cotton, most commonly used in your clothes. So my shirt is dyed blue. Again, I've described what dyes are in my video, so head over there and check that out. It's really informative. So on the subject of the difference between pigments and dyes, I have here some paint samples that I did with Matisse paints. I've got Mayan Red, Mayan Violet and Midnight Blue here. And I've written on this piece of paper, I've just drawn my swatch, they're completely dry. And I've written in permanent marker the colours on top of each. The difference between a pigment and a dye is the pigment won't stain the material that it's on. So it's insoluble and it won't dissolve and it won't stain the paper. However, the dye that is in the Sharpie marker that I used is designed to stain the fibers that it's in. And you can tell this when you flip it over. So you can clearly see that Sharpie marker through the back of the paper as the dye has stained the paper. It's actually in the fiber of the paper. However, the paint with the pigment is just sitting on top of the paper and it's bound to it by the actual acrylic polymers in the paint. So here you can't see any of that paint through the paper. Now there is the off chance that a little bit of pigment will seep through the actual fibers, like the physical bond of the paper. So a little piece might sink through there or sink through there or sink through there, but you can't see it. Okay, so you might see a little bit here and here. A little bit of water could have been in there, and when I did open these paints there was a little bit of water in the end of the tubes, So there's a couple of little splotches there, and that's what I would attribute that to, whereas the Midnight Blue didn't have any of that. So that's pigment and dye. Acrylic paint. So the difference between acrylic, oil, and latex-based paints. Acrylic paint is a chemical-based paint. So while it can be dissolved in water, it is a combination of acrylic polymers, plastic polymers, binders, thickeners, pigments, sometimes mica powders as well. And you do need to clean them up with water. Most acrylic-based paints are clean up with water, but you will need something like soap or detergent to break down the paint completely. So again, while you can thin down acrylic paint with water, to completely dissolve it and break apart those chains so that they no longer exist, something like dishwashing liquid or detergent is used to break that apart. Oil-based paints are exactly as they say. It's pigment suspended in an oil-based solution, and they do take a lot longer to dry than acrylic paints do because the oil doesn't have any water in it. So by the time that dries, it's usually a longer period instead of a matter of weeks, and can be months or years. Oil-based paints need to be cleaned up with thinners or turpentine, really strong harsh chemicals, to break apart that oil structure. Latex-based paints, on the other hand, are completely water-based. So the reason that they're water-based is so that they're far easier to clean up when used in big applications. So all of your house paint, wall paint, ceiling paint, that's all latex water-based paint. And what they do is they add latex protein into the paint, and that helps it to extend and stretch further when you're applying it on those walls. So when you're applying it with a roller, the chemical chains in the paint can stretch a bit further and you get a lot more volume out of it. They're often a lot cheaper to produce than acrylic paint, so that's why you can get bulk house paint for a lower price. Very easy to clean up, simple, wash everything in water, you don't even need any soap. Soap will help speed up that process. Now, if you were to clean up with 99% isopropyl alcohol, even though it is a water-based paint, the alcohol will interfere with the chemical structure of the paint and it will break up. So that will break up even dried up paint. Resin. Resin is actually an organic compound, and it's most commonly found as tree sap. So resin is a natural defense mechanism of the trees. When the tree's inflicted a wound or a cut, it will leak sap. And what the sap will do is oxidize with the air and form a hard shell around the tree. Pretty sure most of us have all experienced this. And that's to protect the tree from infection. Now, it's beneficial to us because we've been able to manipulate that and turn it into a two-part compound most of the time. Some resins are single-part compounds, most are two-part, some of them have three parts, which includes a catalyst, and the catalyst basically just speeds up the reaction of the resin. However, most of them that we find for art are two-part compounds. You've got a part A and a part B. Part A is the resin itself, and part B is usually the hardener. And when you mix the two together, they produce a reaction, a chemical reaction, in which the resin sets fairly quickly. So on a tree, that reaction may take 2 to 3 days for that resin to fully harden. However, in the chemical reaction that's going on in our resin, it's hard within 12 to 24 hours. However, that reaction, the chemical reaction in the resin, takes up to 30 days to get a full, perfectly hard, perfectly heat resistant cure. Most resins will tell you on the bottle exactly how long it takes for their resin to cure. Most are between 3 and 7 days. However, maximum hardness is always reached after 30 days. It's important to let that time period elapse if you're selling anything, so that you don't run the risk of people getting rings or dents in their coasters or their placemats or anything that's being shipped out that's for functional use. Allow that 30 days to pass so that there's no risk of anything negative happening to your resin. Substrate. A substrate is a simple scientific term for a surface or a medium. So for example, a piece of paper is a substrate. Solvents and solutes. A solvent is a chemical that can dissolve a solute, and by extension, a solute is something that can be dissolved in a solvent. The term soluble means able to be dissolved by a solvent. So for example, sugar and water. If you put a spoonful of sugar in a cup of water and give that a good mix around, the sugar will dissolve into the water. By fully dissolving, it becomes a solution where the sugar is chemically bonded to the water. However, in the case of pigments, they do not become chemically bonded to the liquid that they're being dissolved in. They form a suspension. So a suspension is any solution where the pigments or particles mixed into the chemical are not being dissolved and become part of the chemical structure. So for example, if I had a cupful of sugar and water and a cupful of dirt and water, and I gave both a good mix, chucked the lid on, and let them sit for a couple of months, the sugar and water would not form a layer of sugar crystals. The sugar would not be visible because it's now become part of the chemical solution of the water. However, with the dirt and water, you would make mud to start with, but after a couple of months, the dirt and all of the dirty particles in there would settle out onto the bottom of the jar, and you would be left with clear water on the top. Dyes, on the other hand, are water soluble, so just like your sugar and water, that dye will colour that water and it will be permanently coloured forever. There's no taking that dye out of it. Now we move on to flocculation, cracking and crazing. Flocculation is a scientific term, mainly used in chemistry, to describe the action of when pigments or particles leave the main suspension and they clump together. So in painting, you may have noticed this, especially when using pigments, that the pigments tend to form little spots all over the painting, or they break apart from the main mass. So you may see, for example, a blob of blue, and then on the edges where everything's been spread out a fair bit, you may see little particles of blue and it looks like your paint is breaking apart. That's what we call flocculation. Crazing is similar, but it is not on a particle level. Crazing is when your layer of paint shears apart while it is still wet. So this often happens if you have a rather thick base layer with a thinner layer on top, and the base layer moves apart, similar to what happens with the tectonic plates during an earthquake. They either rub together or move apart. In this case, they'll be moving apart and your paint forms jagged cracks all the way through that paint layer. It can happen in one layer and it can happen in multiples. Cracking, on the other hand, usually happens when the painting is dried or drying, and you'll notice that because you may be able to see the pillow through all of your colors and you will have fissures. So I have an example of that. So here I have an example of a record that has cracked. So you can see there these deep fissures where the paint has cracked because I left too much pillow on my surface. So as that has dried, acrylic paint naturally expands and contracts when it's drying, and by leaving too much on there, I've got these deep fissures in my painting. Okay, so that's an example of cracking. Here is an example of crazing or flocculation. So you can see that my pigment has broken up as it's gone over the edge of the canvas, and it is usually more prominent on the edges of a piece as the paint falls over the edge and a lot of shear force is put onto the paint. So that's S-H-E-A-R. And think of that as water rushing over the edge of a cliff for a waterfall. As the water flows over, it doesn't flow in a steady stream, it breaks up into hundreds of tiny little droplets. And that's exactly what happens when the paint flows over the edge here. So ways you can solve that, adding more pigments to them, making them thinner. Making them thinner will also help them to flow better. Thicker paints will tend to craze and flocculate a lot more over the edges, as the paint is doing its best to try and bind to itself, but as gravity pulls it down, it just tears it apart. I have another example of that on this one that might be able to be seen better. So there's another example you can see in that green. I've got a fair bit of crazing in there. Now that's not quite flocculation. Flocculation, I would say, is more like here where my paints have broken up. And you can see that the pigment is trying to break free of the main mixture. So I do the Sheleeart Bloom technique, and if you're interested in learning that, you can check the link in the description box below. Join our members only Facebook group. We've got a lot of help in there, and I'm actually one of the instructors for Australia in there. Lots of great help. Warping is something that we come across with ourselves very often, and it's usually denoted by our paints being too thin, drying time too long, cell activate being off. There's a lot of things that can cause warped cells. An example of warped cells are like this on this record. So you can tell they're all warped because they're all misshapen. They're not evenly shaped. They're not an even size. And the reason that happened was because I had too much paint on my surface and I tried to spin it a few too many times. And what's happened is all of the paint, instead of flowing nicely, the pillow got too thin and the rest of the paint on top flowed over the top of it. Also, my cell activator was too thin and just slid over the top of my pouring medium. So consistency is very important to preventing your cells from warping. So there you have it. There's a short little glossary of terms that you may come across when you're painting. Hopefully they explain a few things in a little bit more depth than what you may see in groups. It's very hard to sort of type out an explanation that's easily understandable, so it often helps to visualize things. Hopefully my little demonstration helps you to understand that a little bit better. So if you're really liking the videos that I'm putting out, don't forget to watch them all, like them, subscribe them, and hit that little notification bell so that you know every time that I upload a video. I schedule my videos for every Monday at 12 PM, so my time in Australia. And yeah, I try to keep that up every week. Hopefully you're enjoying them. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks guys.